I think was, okay. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, I think, was a surprise event affecting multiple countries. Fukushima, maybe, Japan, the triple disaster, the Haiti earthquake that devastated a capital city, COVID, of course, and we might be, as I said, we'll, in retrospect, witnessing a black swan event right now when a major cross-border invasion of a country by a major power that has advanced weaponry is taking place. That was certainly not expected and caught people off guard. So I just wanted to talk about the black swans. You know, obviously they catch us by surprise. The humanitarian community is not accustomed or prepared to deal with them, and they generate unexpected consequences and opportunities and risks. By definition, they're outlier events. They're in the realm of scientific possibility and human experience, but they are by definition low probability and high consequence. And so doing historical data crunching is not usually effective in sort of predicting or anticipating these sort of black swan mega disasters. And I think we need sort of out of the black box thinking in order to anticipate them rather than some of the traditional approaches. Why are we so bad at anticipating black swan mega disasters? So I'm going to use my undergraduate degree in literature and refer to 3 characters from ancient Greek literature to talk about the problems with early action to dealing with black swans. The first example is from Homer's Iliad, Cassandra. Of course, the tragic prophetess who was cursed to make predictions to be a prophet, but no one would believe her. And so this is sort of a common phenomenon in sort of crisis prediction. You know, there are individuals and small groups that do predict these types of things, but they're usually not acted upon. And in the case of Cassandra, she had the satisfaction of being able to tell everyone, "I told you so." But as you remember, it turned out led to the destruction of Troy, and she was murdered. So it didn't turn out very well for her. The second literary example is from Aesop's Fables, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, who was a young shepherd whose job it was to warn the villagers about a wolf attack on their flocks. And of course, as you remember from the story, he would make these false alarms, sometimes by mistake, sometimes intentionally, and eventually he lost all of his credibility, and the wolf did in fact attack and attack the flock, and he ended up eating, according to the fable, he was eaten by the wolf. So it didn't turn out very well for him either. And then the third example I'll refer to from Greek literature is Oedipus Rex, who was given a prophecy, if you know the story, and he was given the prophecy and he did everything he could to sort of prevent it from happening, but despite that, it happened anyway. It became sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as you remember from the story, the prophecy had 2 different impacts on his 2 parents, and also led to the destruction of his kingdom of Thebes. So in all of these cases of people trying to predict these sort of the unexpected events. It didn't turn out very well. So anyway, I mean, maybe we'll get into more from personal experience in the question and answer. But I wanted to, there's a new book that just came out called The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in the Age of Disasters by Juliette Kayyem. And she's a former US Department of Homeland Security official. And Juliette Kayyem proposes the idea that we can't really predict or prevent black swan disasters. The best we can do is sort of accept that they're going to happen, minimize the losses and consequences so that later we sort of can recognize that it could have been much worse. And that's the best we can do. And we can also sort of perhaps take advantage of some of the unexpected opportunities that emerge from these events and use those opportunities to make real structural changes that nobody was willing to make over the past years. It takes a sort of a galvanizing event to generate these types of change. And that so you can maybe make these changes. And the next black swan event is, in her words, less bad. And then just finally, the other book I'd recommend is Richard Clarke's, former State Department official, whose book Warnings, Finding Cassandras to Stop Catastrophes, also looks at a number of case studies of individuals, professors, people who worked in government who did sort of warn about the possibility of a certain black swan type of events and were ignored. So just to end up sort of plugging two books that I sort of recommend.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for that framing, and thank you for taking us out of the aid bubble and throwing a bit of literature in there. When you were speaking, it made me think, Lydia, when I read on the Center for Disaster Protection's website, it says that you think the relative livelihood of disasters can be predicted and that you can manage the impact of these disasters if you have the right plans in place. And so, I know sometimes the head of the center speaks of dull disasters. Let's make disasters dull so that we get much better at managing. So from your perspective, is it maybe even wrong to speak of black swans? Is that even a relevant concept? Are we just poor planners? What's your thinking on that?
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess one of our basic premises at the centre is that if you can arrange financing for a crisis in advance, then you should. But that does rely on being able to anticipate crises and their impacts so that you can devise credible plans and put in place financing once you've got a sense of how much funding you're going to need and when. The question that you're pointing out for black swan events is how can you actually make financial sensible provision for these large-scale complex shocks where their impacts might be huge, but in fact they're very difficult to predict and anticipate and plan for? And also bearing in mind that there are opportunity costs associated with locking up funding for events that might or might not happen. So it's very difficult for decision makers to commit funds when the level of uncertainty is as high as it's likely to be in the case of black swan events. So I think I'd argue that it's very difficult to plan for specific black swan events because they are by nature hard to predict. But there are probably three big things that decision makers ought to be doing that could help to put the whole international crisis response system in a much better position to manage these magnitude of shocks when they do occur. So first of all, I think we should probably get a lot better at preparing for the things that you can predict and putting in place financial preparedness for those. So that would enable us to respond better, more efficiently, more predictably to those sorts of crises and to buy us some more flexibility within the system to respond to those things which are much more difficult to anticipate. So at the centre, we tend to put these different types of crisis risks into three broad buckets. So risks which can be modelled and planned for, so often hydrometeorological risks, where we have a fairly decent modelling ability to anticipate the frequency and the magnitude and to put in place plans and financing for those. And then crises which you can't model, but you can probably be fairly confident about the rough size and shape of the financial requirements each year. So particularly for protracted crises and complex emergencies. And in those cases, we could be doing a much better job at budgeting and committing funding on a more predictable basis for those. And then one of the benefits of having this greater financial preparedness for crises is that in the process of negotiating these, you tend to have greater clarity around who ultimately is on the hook for the funding for those situations before they happen. And then that can help you to elicit commitments so that financing is available on a much more predictable basis. And then for humanitarian actors, this could ultimately mean that governments, the private sector, private citizens, and development partners could be influenced and help to kind of step up and take on these risks in a more predictable way, which would create more space in the international crisis response system to focus on those things which are difficult to predict, and for things where only an impartial humanitarian response will really do. And so the second thing that we need to get better at doing is understanding and preparing for these complex and systemic crises. So I think one thing that we've learned over the last few years is that the nature of crises has changed. So in a highly integrated and mobile global economy, we've got sometimes very large dependencies, particularly on global supply chains. So this means that risks tend to travel along these dependent systems and impact well outside of national boundaries in which the initial shock might have occurred. And we know, for example, from COVID and from the conflict in Ukraine, that a crisis in one place can cascade and have complex impacts which are multifaceted. So the initial shock we may be able to predict, although not always. I think it would have been quite difficult to predict Ukraine. But the variables that influence how that risk is then transmitted and how it impacts are much more difficult to understand and let alone anticipate. But we could, however, anticipate some risks and crises, and we could almost war game scenarios where you would test out multiple potential variables that might interact with these predictable shocks to get some sort of sense of the orders of magnitude and the scope of impacts that we ought to be planning for. And this would give us a much better sense also of how well our systems are likely to perform under stress. So it could give us some good information about where the weaknesses lie in our preparedness. So things like surveillance, coordination, decision-making, social safety nets, public health systems. So that could give us some really good insights that would inform risk-informed development, if you like. So medium-term investments in better preparedness for large-scale and complex shocks. But it would also give us planning figures in terms of the ranges of costs that we ought to be preparing for as the international crisis response system. That would give us a sense of what sorts of level of costs we should be thinking about being able to bear in the future. And so the third thing is to building on that information to build much greater flexibility into our financial capabilities to be able to respond to these very large peaks in demand. So at the moment, there's almost no scope to expand the size of the pot in relation to growing demand. And we have long-term caseloads which are lingering in the appeals for years and years and years. Aid budgets are growing much more slowly than the rate of growth in humanitarian needs. And then when you lay on top of that a large-scale systemic shock, then the system really struggles. And you tend to get very unequal funding responses across different crises. So, for example, at the moment, the funding response against the UN coordinated appeal for Ukraine is about 45% met, whereas funding to all other appeals are only 6% met. So in order to be able to respond to these large peaks in demand, I think we need to urgently devise and commit to new financing solutions that would enable us to accommodate and flex to respond to large increases in demand. And I'm very pleased that Nico Ross from the SAF is going to follow me to perhaps say a few words about how the system can maybe do that a bit better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lydia. And I think you almost made the bridge for me there perfectly. Nico, you started working on this since 2019. SURF has invested in anticipatory action. You funded things that hasn't happened yet. What was that like, that shift, and what's your experience with providing that type of financing for the system?
Yeah, thanks. So let me start by giving an example. So right now, people in the Horn of Africa are facing one of the worst droughts in many years. There have been 4 now failed rainy seasons, and now there are even forecasts that the next rainy season at the end of the year may also be below average. And so drought is a slow onset emergency, and rainy seasons, to some extent at least, they are predictable. There's of course always uncertainty, but the current situation in the Horn of Africa isn't really a surprise. And so OCHA, together with our partners, we've applied an anticipatory approach in the Horn of Africa to get ahead of the drought. And SURF, the UN's Global Humanitarian Fund, for which I work at OCHA, we've provided $55 million to our partners to implement anticipatory actions. And that started as early as July 2020 and has by now reached almost 2 million people. And so how did we do this? We are supporting 12 anticipatory action frameworks that humanitarian country teams are working on with support from different parts at OCHA headquarters, UN agency headquarters, the Center for Humanitarian Data. And those frameworks are at different stages, and some are still under development, but all of them have 4 elements. So they all have a trigger, they all have an action plan, they have pre-agreed financing, and importantly, there's also a learning component built into each of these frameworks. And they cover things like flooding in Nepal and Bangladesh, for example, typhoons in the Philippines, drought in the Sahel, or we're working on cholera in DRC right now. But since SURF has given more than $1 billion in funding for drought response since 2006, our first 2 frameworks were set up in Somalia and Ethiopia for anticipatory action for drought. And so from these frameworks, we are learning a lot of good lessons, and we're trying to apply these lessons to all our funding. So the anticipatory action funding, but also our other funding streams, so that we can make our funding more forward-looking globally in all contexts, not just in those countries where we have frameworks in place. And so learning in all of these frameworks is a key component, and the research into these anticipatory action frameworks, and some together with the Center for Disaster Protection, has shown that anticipatory action can be faster, it can be more cost-effective, and because we have more time to prepare, it can also allow humanitarian organizations to better target what affected people or people at risk say their own priorities are. And we're also learning, of course, from the work that the good anticipatory action work that many partners are doing. So UN agencies, the IFRC, the START Network, and many others are working on anticipatory action in over 60 countries. One of the lessons we've learned is that under some circumstances, we can make better use of projections and forecasts. And so now we're trying to take, for example, projections of future food insecurity into account to a greater degree, also for our rapid response funding to move from rapid response increasingly to early action. And that has allowed us to apply this in other contexts as well. But also in other ways, we found that the distinction between humanitarian response and anticipatory action is not always that binary. For example, some of our anticipatory action frameworks, they include triggers that are based on observational data. So some people may say then that's not truly anticipatory if it's based on observations rather than on forecasts. But the thing is, if the forecasts fail, then you still have a fail-safe mechanism in place, and that still allows you to act many months before the full humanitarian impact of a shock materializes. And so whether for anticipatory action or for rapid response, humanitarian response, the decisions we have to make, the funding decisions, are based on incomplete and uncertain data all the time. But what we can do is we can use advances in predicting disasters, and especially climate-related disasters, to be as anticipatory as possible and to mitigate humanitarian impact where that's possible. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Nico. Now, next, it's you, Anticipatory, and you work with ACAPS, and ACAPS' slogan is "See the crisis, change the outcome." So on one side, do the best possible decision-making support. On the other hand, try to make sure that decision makers actually use the data and change the way they behave. So how do you work with the risk list, with the other anticipatory products that ACAPS does? And what do you do to make sure that it's actually picked up by the people who make decisions?
Thank you, Lex Peter. When we started preparing for this session today, we had a brainstorm with my colleague Francesca, who is a senior analyst in the crisis insight team. And we tried to take a look into our risk list, but also into the risks that we have not identified that actually happened. And we split them into three broad categories. First of all is the crisis we did not see coming. And I think Dennis did a good job mentioning a lot of them actually at the beginning of the session. Apart from the obvious with the COVID, the current one with Ukraine, I want to mention also Afghanistan last year, which many people in the humanitarian sector were really surprised with the overtake of Afghanistan from the Taliban. When we looked into some social media analytics platform that we used, searching for some key terms around Afghanistan and Ukraine and the predominant feelings that were expressed by users. And we saw that on one case, on the Ukraine case, the third more predominant feeling, and on the Afghanistan case, the second one was surprise. And I think, okay, the social media is a more broad audience, but actually in the humanitarian sector, if we could analyze our reactions, probably we would have very similar outcomes coming up. The second category is about the crisis they were very big. Some people would call them predicted, but we actually saw them coming as a sector. And unfortunately, we had very few in this list. The first one that came in mind, the bigger one, was actually Venezuela, and the significant deterioration in the humanitarian conditions in Venezuela a few years back. The third one was the predictions, the crisis that could have happened, but actually never happened. So what is in our risk list that we predicted that would deteriorate significantly, but never materialized? We had very few examples there. Lebanon is one that comes in mind. We had predicted at some point the total economic collapse of Lebanon, which maybe we can, some would argue to a point materialized, but not maybe to the extreme that we had predicted, at least not yet. And the next step basically was to question a bit ourselves on why aren't we better at predicting these events as humanitarian analysts? And not talking only about the ACAPS team, but the broader, like the humanitarian analyst community in the sector. What can we do to make this better? I came up with 4 different reasons why, without actually looking, and those reasons are not actually looking into the methodology of how can we improve our methodology, how can we build a more rigorous way of identifying risks. The first one is because we're not actually brave in our analysis. Very, very often humanitarian analysts tend to go towards the marked deterioration way, where we often develop our risks around the deteriorating crisis and the trends that we are seeing. And we are very hesitant on going one step further, on looking into what is the extreme scenario, how could things actually look if the worst happened. And very often we are very hesitant on going there. Second is that even if we go to the extreme scenario, very often we are not fast enough. With Ukraine, we started looking into a complete invasion of the country, basically, but it was too late. It was only a few weeks before it actually happened. So obviously, the decision makers did not have time to prepare for that, even if we communicated it effectively. I think this is the same case across the sector. When do we consider actually that we are successful in an analysis? Is 2 weeks enough? Is 2 months enough? How early is it enough? we don't really have any criteria to decide when are we successful on communicating and on informing decision makers. The third one is that very often we are not asking the right questions. Especially as analysts, we should be focusing on answering very exact questions. Very often we tend to be very broad. We are asking ourselves, how will Ukraine look in the next 6 months? But we're not asking the exact questions that we need to ask. For example, what is the probability of Russia invading Ukraine in the next month? That's maybe the question we should have asked ourselves 3 months ago. The fourth one has actually a lot to do with communication, because very often we are not very good at communicating our predictions in an effective way. We don't use simple terms. We use a lot of jargon. We tend to maybe even to over-focus on the methodology in an attempt to justify the predictions and the work that we're doing. Dennis before talked about Cassandra, and I don't know how many of you have read the Iliad, but why was Cassandra not heard? It was because no one could actually understand what she was talking about, because she was talking in a very poetic way. She was talking about with a very prophetic speech, and no one could actually understand what does she mean by what she says. So how can we actually improve the way that we communicate? How can we be better as analysts in getting our analysis in the hands of the decision makers in a way that they can use it? I don't know if I have more time, but the last thing I want to talk about is basically how do we overcome the fear of prediction? As humanitarian analysts, what can we do to make things better? And the whole point is, how can we get ourselves to feel comfortable enough to make a mistake? The risk analysis is not about getting everything right. And very often we forget that when we actually do the work. Chiara, who is our data scientist, and she recently joined the ECAPS team. When she first joined, she did a very quick analysis based on a risk list. And I have the graph printed here if later anyone in the room wants to see it, about the percentage of materialized risk that we have in the ECAPS risk list based on the probability assigned by the analyst. So per probability category, how many of the risks that we have identified over the past 2 years actually materialized. And what we saw is that actually 100% of the very high probability of the very probable risk materialized. And as we go down, less and less percentage of risks materialized. We go to the very low category of probability. We have a 5-point scale. At the very low probability, 0% of the risk materialized. And actually, when I saw that, I was extremely happy with the results, because it shows that, okay, our analysts, they're not afraid of making some predictions that they don't materialize. And we have really tried hard over the past year to make this be okay for the team, to make our analysts feel that it's okay to make mistakes because it's risk analysis. We're not trying to predict exactly what will happen. And this is still useful for decision makers because it stretches mindsets. So we'll leave you with a request, actually. I would like to encourage you all to visit our risk list online. And there is also a screen in the main room here when you can actually go and see it. And I want to challenge you to send us your feedback. And if you see that we are not going far enough with our predictions in some events, and you think that we could do better in predicting the unpredictable, tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Angeliki. So if I hear right, we're not brave enough, we're too slow, we're not asking the right questions, so we don't know how to communicate, and we should be more comfortable with making mistakes. Yeah? Jonas, you worked with early warning information management in various positions. You now sit in Undp. and provide decision-making support from there. Does any of what you just heard tally with your own experience? How are you working with identifying the right risks on the horizon, and how does your work help us as a collective make better decisions?
A lot, Lars, Peter, and thanks to all the other panelists for their interesting contributions. Of course, there's a lot that resonates here, and kudos to the ACAPS team for putting together this risk list. I think it's a great tool. I'll answer your question a bit. First, I'll set the scene a little bit. Now, many here might be wondering why UNDP is so interested in anticipation in the first place. After all, as a development organization, we have a long planning horizons, and our response times may sometimes seem slower than in the humanitarian sector. But anticipation is actually a corporate priority for UNDP. It has a prominent role in the 2022 strategic plan to make the organization more agile and to respond to increasingly complex and uncertain environments to achieve the SDGs. UNDP's work regarding anticipation is really based on the extensive experience on prevention and disaster risk reduction as the main tools to address root causes and to avoid negative impact of shocks on development pathways. So we really conceptualize risk quite broadly in terms of risk to development. And that's something, I guess, that sort of sets us apart from many of the humanitarian risk analysis processes. So UNDP has a lot of experience working on conflict and disasters with significant experience throughout the world. And this has also enabled us to support social and economic systems that are more robust. And maybe to borrow another term from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who coined this term of the black swan, hopefully some of these systems are also more anti-fragile, so gaining in resilience from every challenge and every shock. However, beyond these prevention measures, we also need to make sure that decision makers are aware of key trends and are able to address probable deteriorations that are sort of looming on the horizon. So our work is really quite critical in informing development programming and to respond to anticipated shocks. How do we actually do that? Now, as you already mentioned, our main tool right now is the Crisis Risk Dashboard, which is a data visualization and analysis platform. It allows us to draw on a huge repository of data we can then deploy to analyze and visualize different thematic and geographic trends. And of course, there's definitely a lot of ACAPS data in there as well, including the risk list and then the various severity indicators as well. But we use this data set to guide a subsequent qualitative analysis in addition to signal scanning that we do qualitatively as well. And we then help co-design applications for sort of risk monitoring across the UN system at the regional and country level, and enables country offices to then do their own risk driver tracking. The broad thematic scope of risks to assess that I mentioned just now does represent some challenges though. So while we embrace that risks are truly multidimensional and interconnected, it can sometimes be really difficult to determine what impact we're actually looking for, and thus what qualifies as a relevant risk. Or maybe rather different stakeholders have different understandings of priorities and varying perceptions of what we should focus on. So it is not as straightforward as maybe in the humanitarian sphere where we focus on people in need. Ensuring that we're all on the same page and that early warning, early action processes are connected to and integrated with broader prevention programming is a key priority. And then coming back to picking up this catchphrase of this event and addressing this black swan topic, I'm very much in line with what Lydia mentioned. So spotting black swans ahead of time cannot be done by definition because unknown unknowns cannot be detected purely by knowns. I think that's quite obvious to everyone here, but it needs to be said. So should we spend time trying to identify something that is unidentifiable? Well, I think that we can at least determine potential categories of black swan events, even though we don't really know, we're not able to predict where, when, and how these black swan events will materialize. And to borrow another metaphor, another example from Taleb's book about economic crises and predicting, the Black Monday stock crash. Sure, we can't necessarily predict that a drastic event like that will happen on one day, but the category of something like that happening is very well known, just like many of the other examples that were just flagged related to conflict events, but also various other natural hazards. So that really puts us in a position where we're able to implement contingency plans for these different impact categories and that sort of interrupt these potential impact pathways. Of course, that's complicated. Lydia mentioned that we're increasingly connected, and the impact of COVID and the Ukraine crisis showed us that our supply chains are even more vulnerable and transmit these channels extremely fast. But I think we definitely are in a position to develop firewalls that can intersect these transmissions. And I believe that development programming has a key role here to play to make these systems anti-fragile. In line with Dennis's comment, I'd like to also actually make two book recommendations, if I may. It's very much in line with what you just mentioned. John Kay and Mervyn King's Radical Uncertainty, Decision-Making Beyond the Numbers, which looks exactly at these questions about how do we predict things that are not really detectable through even the more advanced statistical means that luckily we have had access to over the last decades. And another one which really hit the spot in terms of the Cassandra problem that also Angeliki mentioned is Christopher Meyer's warning about conflict, which looks at how can decision makers be effectively influenced, what are the ways in which this should happen. I do recommend both books quite highly. And back to you, Lars Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonas. So we've heard 5 different takes on this black swan issue we're discussing today, and we have actually a couple of really good questions from the colleagues who are online, and so I'll pick 1 or 2 of those. If here in the room you have any questions, please signal to Anna or Rocio. They will bring you a mic so we can hear your questions. But we will start with a question from Tala, who asks, basically, how do we shift donor funding away from this short-term cycle and towards a more long-term, sustainable, adaptive model? And I think I'll ask you, Lydia, to maybe have a go at that one. And if any of you want to chip in afterwards, please feel free. But Lydia, why don't you take that first?
Thank you. It's a really tough one. And I think particularly for humanitarian actors where there seems to be a kind of zero-sum scenario. So if you allocate funding which could be used for immediate needs now towards needs which have not yet happened, that's a very difficult ethical decision to make. So I think ultimately, if we're going to provide predictable and sustainable funding for predictable needs, they probably shouldn't be sitting in humanitarian budgets. They should over time be kind of graduated across to development supported, but ultimately government, private sector and private citizen financed instruments and means of responding. So I think we can think about how to support that transition through providing proof of concept of the efficiency and effectiveness gains of earlier anticipatory finance in the humanitarian sector, through strengthening and supporting and enabling disaster risk financing supported with ODA funding. But ultimately, it's going to be very difficult given the growing caseloads for humanitarians to provide a stable enough commitment for prearranged financing to function effectively for the long term. So I think we should be thinking, how do humanitarian actors engage with development actors and with governments and the private sector to try and have a greater awareness of where responsibility for bearing these risks ultimately ought to lie. And I think, that would be my suggestion. It's a sort of a medium to long-term strategy, but I think we need to start with the acceptance that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for humanitarians to take on bearing the cost of predictable needs long-term on their own.
Thank you, Lydia. Any comments from the other panel members? No. Yeah, please go ahead, Nico.
Yeah, I agree with what Lydia said. It is a very difficult decision, and humanitarian needs and humanitarian funding requirements are growing and growing. At the same time, we do see a lot of support from from governments for humanitarian anticipatory action. So we had a high-level event in September last year. There were 75 countries, and they expressed a lot of support for humanitarian anticipatory action. Maybe, I guess what's important, what several of the panelists have mentioned, and also what several people are asking in the comments is, if black swan events are really unpredictable, then we shouldn't try to predict them. And I agree with that. So I think we should really be, really make this tough decisions about which events can be predicted. So several of the panelists have talked about categorizing events into different buckets or different categories. And I think it's important to start with those that are more easily predictable. But then for those events, there's really, I think, little reason not to get ahead of the humanitarian impact if it is possible to do so.
Great, thank you for that, Nico. If you have any questions here in the room, please bring your mic down there. Meanwhile, we will take Paul's question online. He asks, does the unintended consequences of government policy count as a black swan event? For example, Sri Lanka, they banned fertilizer and the resulting food shortages, there's price increases and civil unrest, which was not predicted. Maybe I'll throw that one to Angeliki and then ask Jonas to follow up on that.
So I think as a black swan event, I mean, it always depends on how we define it. There is no exact definition for that such an event, but it could be any type of event that has an extreme impact on the, or even just a significant impact on the, either on the existing humanitarian needs in a country, in a crisis, or in generating additional humanitarian needs in a crisis. The issue with that is always the unpredictability. So when is such an event, and the Sri Lanka one may be a very also good example of that, when is an event that we always, after it happened, think that we should have seen it and we should have prepared for it. Because either we were unable to respond in the humanitarian needs generated out of this event effectively, or because we were too late and we did not have enough resources. The issue always with those events is that to always think why we cannot also do them. And when we are trying to, sometimes it's like we don't really want the unpredictable to happen. We always try to stay within the limits of the events that we can predict because we think that we can respond to those events. So even when we're looking into a deteriorating situation, we think, what is the worst that we could actually respond to? And we don't tend to think on what is if something happens that is way out of our resources.
Thank you, Jonas.
Thanks a lot. I tend to agree with Angeliki on this concrete Sri Lanka example. I have to say that I don't think that qualifies as a black swan event, mainly also because I'm aware of analyses that were written sometime last year that exactly predicted these sort of consequences, right? So anybody who's really involved in the day-to-day business of doing risk analysis knows that this sort of stuff, in my opinion, doesn't really qualify. But it brings up an interesting question because in terms of what qualifies as a black swan event, there's this inherent hindsight bias that after it happens, everyone says, oh, we should have known about it. We should have seen this coming. But that really puts us in a position where if we do not measure regularly what we're actually predicting and the events that we're actually forecasting, then we're not, then by definition, we're going to have more and more black swan events, just we're not able to track them accordingly. And so ACAPS's risk list, I think, is extremely important because that allows us actually, and the issue that Angeliki mentioned before about actually measuring to what extent the prediction actually came true is extremely important. And there are much more robust and much more wider initiatives looking at this right now, including the Good Judgment Project, Metaculus. There are huge resources that are being put in place to be able to actually have an evidence base, whether or not something was predicted or not. I think I'll leave it at that now, but happy to elaborate later on.
Thank you, Jonas. The gentleman, please introduce yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, my name's Tim Waits. I have worked for the UK government in the humanitarian department working on resilience. I'm now with the Australian permanent mission here in Geneva. And I think the other thing that we have not been good at predicting at is where the humanitarian trajectory has gone. So 10 or 12 years ago, 15 years ago, we were, the mantra a little bit was build resilience and then the humanitarian needs will reduce. And now we're in a place where that isn't the case. And I think that it should have been maybe 15 years ago that we were thinking about different systems, different mechanisms, different financing. So I think we're kind of behind the curve on this one. I mean, climate, was that predictable 15 years ago? It was being talked about. But the way things have built and grown, I think, have not been predicted either. And so this is why we're seeing these mega disasters now.
Great. Dennis, do you want to comment on that? Are we behind the curve? Should we have been faster?
Well, you could always look back and be faster, be more reactive, be better prepared, anticipating, implement early action. There's another sort of concept that came after the Black Swan. The author called it the Gray Rhino, which is an obvious thing that we all sort of see, but we ignore it. We don't take it into account. Maybe that is what climate change is, or you could find some other examples. But these are not black swans, not outlier, low probability events, but sort of things that we all sort of see staring us in the face, but we just don't act upon them and don't galvanize around them. And so this is sort of another phenomenon that we could address, and I think relates to the black swans.
Thank you, Dennis. And maybe I'll ask Lydia. Could you comment on this also, because the center you work for has been created to do smarter financing, and whenever I speak to one of you guys, it just makes all the sense in the whole world. But we don't seem to be able, as governments, to really adopt much smarter financing models. Or am I being too negative? Are we behind the curve, or are we actually changing?
I mean, I think we see some indications of change, but I think we know even from, the high-income country governments and their lack of preparedness for recent large-scale shocks such as COVID, that decision makers will often undervalue the investments required to put in place proper provision for future risk. And it's partly a function of our short-term electoral cycles, and just people just tend to underestimate risk. So as I think Dennis mentioned at the beginning, the aftermath of a big shock is often a good time to try and push for change. So I think people will be potentially much more receptive to understanding the fairly intuitive logic of preparing in advance for crises. But I think it's also, we also got to be a little bit realistic in that right now, a lot of governments, even if they buy into the idea of financial preparedness for disasters and putting in place new instruments and tools and systems, they face very many fiscal pressures right now. So it's a hard environment to try to convince decision makers of the need for this. And I just also wanted to pick up a little bit on, I think was it Tim Waits' point about resilience, and whether we've, I guess, sort of lost time in focusing on a trajectory of humanitarian needs that I think was largely often focused a lot in the aftermath of the World Humanitarian Summit, that I think was sort of a nice fantasy. And I think I would agree that we have failed to get to grips with actually the trajectory of risk in the intervening years, until suddenly we're faced with these huge caseloads and very little investment in the underlying systems that would be needed to respond to those in a meaningful way. And so I think now is really the time for a large-scale shift in the focus of a lot of development investments. And I think probably Jonas mentioned some of these in terms of how to make systems anti-fragile and how to interrupt the impacts of risks. I think this is something that development actors writ large should be taking much more seriously, is how do we risk-proof all of our development investments? How do we make sure that development investments are risk-informed, that they're not, at the very least, they should not be creating new risks, and ideally they should be targeted on the basis of vulnerability and an understanding that we are undermining the foundations of the ecosystems and climate that sustain us. So we need to take that into account when we are planning and investing for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Lydia. Now, picking up on Dennis's Gray Rhino, there's a question online saying, what was COVID really a black swan? We had the 1918 flu, we had SARS, we had MERS. Was governments just hiding their heads in the sand? Was that really a black swan, or was it a gray rhino that we should have seen coming? And I think that one goes to maybe Jonas and then Angeliki.
Sure. Yeah, I think Taleb himself has said that he doesn't really consider COVID a black swan. And I tend to agree with that. In general, I don't believe that there are very many black swans in existence at all, to the extent that they're relevant to us and to our work. As I mentioned before, there are certain risk categories and risk types that I believe we're very much aware of, and we can do contingency planning for. After MERS, after SARS, it was extremely evident that something like this was going to happen. We can't predict where, when, and how it's going to happen. But it is reasonable that there's going to be a high impact event, and experts have been warning about this for years, if not decades. So again, the real issue is how can we develop systems that are robust enough to take into consideration the ripple effects and the plethora of different subsequent impacts that maybe right now at face value we're not really aware of. But if we invested time and effort, it would be completely self-evident that our current supply chains, our current economic systems are so intermingled that there will be repercussions throughout the world. And we saw the same thing again now with Ukraine and with Russia. The entire agricultural markets in terms of both direct food supply in terms of wheat, but also indirect for fertilizers. Everybody who looks at the data is able to see that this is a major vulnerability and that there are going to be severe ripple effects throughout the world. So it's not really about whether or not it is a black swan or not. I believe that we're able to anticipate the kind of impacts that are relevant for us, and through, as Lydia mentioned, through risk-aware development programming, through integrating these sort of calculations into our out-of-fragility strategies, for instance, that's something we can really focus on, and that where we can really make a major impact on a systemic basis and not on an immediate preparedness and response basis. Over.
Thanks, Jonas. Angeliki?
I agree actually with what Jonas said. Specifically for climate change, I think we have been warned early enough and loud enough that we will never be able to claim that that will be a black swan event. But also for many of the other risks that we discussed today, such as, for example, Venezuela comes in mind, and even Ukraine, we should have seen this coming, and we should have prepared for it better. And we talk a lot about early warning, early action, but I think it's also about putting a lot of focus, not so much on the early warning anymore, but also how do we prepare more effectively, and how do we take the early warning seriously and put some effort in early action and preparedness.
Thank you, Angeliki. Luke?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, my name is Luke Cayley. I'm the information management lead for the IFRC for the last 4 years at least. So one of the things we've done is built a platform which tries to bring risk models in front of decision makers, and the Go platform. We realize, of course, that that's based on just available models. We're curating from the models from our partners, Pacific Disaster Center and so on, Inform and so on. But we see the limitations of that. And actually it comes back to, or reminds me of my previous role as the Crisis Anticipation Advisor for the START Network. I was the first person with that rather grand title, and it took me a while to work out exactly what it meant. One of the things, including the development of a funding mechanism, was trying to find ways to gather information around risks. And one of the things we looked at is, thanks for mentioning it, Jonas, the Good Judgment Project and super forecasting, another quite an easy read to add to your growing book recommendation list. But yeah, I also wanted to thank Angeliki and the ACAPS team, because I think the risk list seems a very interesting and valuable addition. It seems like there are verifiable, and this is the key in my view, verifiable predictions being made there. So yeah, I want to first congratulate you, but then as a question, because that's congratulations is not what we're here for. As a question, how do you encourage how do you avoid groupthink and bias within a closed group of analysts, and to encourage and access the outside view? What are your mechanisms to encourage that? Okay.
Thank you. Very good question, actually, and this is a process. I don't think we are getting it 100% right yet, because it involves a lot of different aspects. First of all, training and retraining the analyst always on considering biases, reviewing often the methodology, which should not be a static thing. It should be evolving based on also the work that we do and the feedback that we receive. But I think the most important and the most challenging is actually getting feedback from practitioners, getting feedback outside of the analysis team. And our analysts recently, over the past 2 years, we actually decentralized a lot the team. And we have analysts that are located essentially all over the world. And this by itself brings a big variety of backgrounds and context analysis and different opinions in the team, which is very positive. But it also gives the opportunity for better networking with practitioners on the ground. But this is something that we really want to enhance further. And we want people not only to use the risk list and say, okay, that was good, I used it in my analysis, but also to feedback on us what they think works, what they think does not work, what can we improve better, but also information. How can we, like as a sector also, how can we be better at sharing information? And this goes, of course, beyond the anticipatory analysis, but specifically for the anticipatory analysis, because it must also be based a lot on not only what is currently happening, but on the different ways that we can imagine things happen in the future, that from different perspectives and from different backgrounds, this may look very, very different again.
Thanks, Angeliki. And Dennis, the Humanitarian Information Unit is actually part of the US intelligence community, right? Well, was that a secret?
Yes, exactly.
So
we don't have it.
So groupthink is something that's really important for you as well to deal with. How does that factor into your work?
Yeah, no, it's the U.S. government has never had a groupthink. That's just unimaginable. All right, that got a good laugh. No, I mean, it's something we recognize, and in the analytical tradecraft, there's, everyone recognizes groupthink and unconscious bias and all of these sort of fallacies that, go into sort of making, not predicting correctly. And just to go back to the Greek literature references, I mean, there are the Cassandras who are outside of groupthink, who are sort of do make sort of wild, what are considered wild predictions, and they are ignored. They're considered, crazy prophetess who speak Babel, and as you said, communication problem. There's the other phenomenon of the boy who cries wolf, who we make predictions about. Lebanon was a good example, but lots of these things that we've been talking about, that this is going to happen, and you know, eventually people just sort of start ignoring those types of things. I mean, working for the US government, decision makers do expect analysts and advisors to be right every single time and predict the time and the place of the next mega disaster. And then even Oedipus Rex, where you have a prediction, but you mishandle it. You implement actions that you think are going to stop it, prevent it, and in fact lead to its sort of self-fulfillment. So in terms of groupthink, there's a lot of you know, things that are recognized. But just the dynamics of human nature make it difficult, both on the part of the decision maker and in terms of the analysts.
I think I'll actually throw this question on to Jonas, and then Nico and Lydia, please comment on this as well, because I think it is relevant for all five of you. How do you inoculate yourself against groupthink in your work? Jonas.
Beyond what was already mentioned, I think going back to one of Lydia's points in terms of wargaming, there's a lot to learn there. You know, there's a red team and blue team analyses where you play off against one another with different scenarios. And there are also interesting hybrid prediction systems that we're looking into, where one part of the information collection is done by one team, and in a gamified mechanism that has sort of feedback loops between information and analysis providers and the analysts, you actually score what extent a certain information piece that you received was relevant in making a certain prediction for a certain risk manifesting or not. And then once you have a scoring, like a beer score regarding your validity of your prediction, that then feeds back to the information unit, which is then able to provide you different kinds of information, always, you know, trying to give a higher score to sort of the factile predictions that are really the ones that we're trying to catch. So there's a lot of really interesting developments happening there. But I think very simple things that Angeliki mentioned in terms of bias reduction and having separate groups, making them as diverse as possible is really the most simple and straightforward step. Over.
Thank you, Jonas. Nico.
I think what's really key is learning and accountability. So, you know, once you make a forecast or don't make a forecast, it's important to then look back and see whether that came true or didn't come true, or, you know, what probability was assigned to a forecast or a projection, and then how did that develop. In German, there's a word that translates as culture of errors, and I think, you know, it's really important to embrace learning from making mistakes and making errors, and, you know, not casting blame or seeing whose fault it was, but to, you know, learn from that in order to do things differently and hopefully better the next time around. And we've talked a lot about, you know, anticipating events, black swans, gray rhinos, and forecasts and so on, projections. But I think it's also important to then focus on the action that was taken or wasn't taken. So whether those were the right things given what, you know, what we were thinking before an event happened. So not just focusing on the anticipation, on the forecast, but also on the action.
Thank you, Nico. Lydia.
Thanks. It's a really interesting question. So how we as an organization try to avoid groupthink. And it's something that I'd say that the centre is on a journey with in much the way that Angeliki described as well. So first of all, we work in like very intentionally multi-sectoral teams. So we will take a piece of work. and have interrogate it from different perspectives. So I work, for example, my background is humanitarian policy and humanitarian action.
We built that into the panel, actually.
And I work with actuaries, risk modelers, economists. And so we bring a lot of different perspectives. But we're also looking at how we recruit more diversely into the team.
Can I hold you just 30 seconds? Yeah. Yeah, there we are. We'll take it after. Yeah. All right, Lydia, we lost you. We actually lost all of you.
Oh,
so
okay.
We had our own little mini black swan here. So please start from the top, Lydia, again.
Okay, I was saying that, so at the centre, we try to work in multidisciplinary teams. So I work, for example, alongside risk modelers, actuaries, economists, and people who are sort of generalists like me with a humanitarian background. So we try to interrogate pieces of work and problems from all of these different perspectives. We're also trying to recruit more diversely, because we are quite conscious that we have, we all come from quite similar backgrounds. And as part of that, also looking to, as I think ACAPS has, established more of a presence in other countries and other regions, and to work in partnership more. And then just to kind of intentionally reach out externally, try to scan the horizon, looking for potential macro level changes that we may not have noticed, because we have got our heads down looking at particular challenges that are in front of us, and trying to bring in perspectives from the private sector, from actors outside of our normal range of people that we would sit in a room with. So I'd say it's something that we're conscious of. It's not easy, and it is it's an ongoing process.
Thank you, Lydia. No? A question here, thank you, please.
I love mine of the One Goal initiative. I was going to try to ask a question, but really invite me for another event like this and give me an hour to talk. Yeah, seriously, I have so much to say about this. For one thing, for instance, in the definitions you had in the beginning, or the definition you had in the beginning, if I heard that right, there was nothing precluding the possibility that we are in an ongoing black swan that we do not see, in that we would, in that our references would be actually moving in a space that is beyond our 3 dimensions, right? Or 4 dimensions. And that is something, the ability to think in an abstract manner would help, I think, go beyond groupthink. But please do invite me to talk.
We will invite you for the next book club as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Any other questions? Did I miss something online? If not, we have about 15 minutes left, and what I would like to do at the end here is to ask each of the panelists because we've had a very, very rich discussion. It's really been interesting to hear the takes you have from your different perspectives. There's been some great questions from the audience. We know that we need to get better at this. We don't necessarily agree how good we are or whatever, but I think we all agree we need to energize this area, because we will need more analysis. We'll need to be more agile, more forward-looking if we are to meet the challenges of the future. So I'd like to ask each of the 5 panelists to give us your wish list. What are the 2-3 things that, if you could have your way, you wish that we as a community would do to kick this forward? What would that be? And we will work it backwards. So Jonas, you're first this time.
Oh, wow, that's a big question. Well, I think bundling capacities is definitely a major thing. There's a lot happening there in terms of in the data infrastructure, the data tools that are available. I still think that there's so much duplication happening in terms of the data that is collected, the information and the analysis that is provided, and the tools that are required to make sense of it all. Bundling all of that, and there's good initiatives happening in the UN and also at the World Bank right now, that are already pushing that forward. Having more players involved there and having those results really feed into concrete results, that would be my wish list for that to actually work really well. Then I would say also a closer engagement between technical focal points and decision makers, and also widening the scope of what we consider as decision makers. Right? Much of this information that we provide in terms of risk analysis is not necessarily relevant only for senior managers that we consider decision makers, but lots of different people at different levels make critical decisions all the time. So having a more direct interaction with those, that will definitely help risk communication. And then, of course, there's a funding issue, of course, in terms of investing in something. This is critical, especially if we look at existential risks or risks that come close to existential demise. There needs to be more capacities dedicated to this, and at least to keep the lights on, if not to really build on something more comprehensive. Those are my three wishes. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonas. Very short and sharp. Angeliki, what's your wish list?
Sorry, it's a tough question, but as an analyst, I have to go first with, I wish that we have better methodology. I wish that we keep improving and be bold on the way that we do analysis and that we collect better data. That's one. The second one is that we, as users, also learn to consume this analysis in a better way. That we understand how to approach this analysis, and the third one also how to translate it into action. To learn not to prepare for the most likely scenario or what we consider the most likely scenario, but to learn how to prepare for varying levels of severity.
Thank you, Angeliki. Then it is Nico, and Nico, you are not allowed to say more. Funding for SURF for anticipatory action.
That was on my list. All right, then my two other wishes are that collectively we become braver, going back to a point that Angeliki made in her introductory remarks, and braver especially in terms of embracing uncertainty, so that we don't wait until there is certainty or near certainty that something will happen, but that even when it is not certain, that we prepare for it. And my second wish, and the two are linked, is that we are also collectively becoming more accountable, and that we look back at the forecasts we've made, the things we anticipated or didn't, and the actions we took or didn't take, and that we learn from that. And more
Thank you very much. Yeah, and more money. Thank you. All right, Lydia.
Thanks. So I think I'd like to see a shift in mindsets and norms towards preparing and particularly making financial provision for crises in advance rather than responding after the fact. So that will require a range of different shifts to enable that to happen. So obviously, first of all, investing in our understanding of the nature and the scale and the distribution of risk, how much money we need to put in place to prepare for that. So understanding what the crisis protection financing gap actually is, and then encouraging and creating incentives for people to make financial provision for that. And that will also involve improving the instruments that we have and creating new ones. And then at the system level, I think there's a real gap in terms of our ability to even conceive of what a good enough and big enough collective response to be able to respond to large scale risk is within the multilateral system. And I think that's partly because the multilateral system is made up of many different components, of which it's no one in particular's responsibility to think on behalf of the system for large-scale complex problems like that. So I think we need a system-level understanding of what sorts of challenges we are likely to face in the future, and then to build the institutions and the financing solutions that would support our ability to respond to and be sort of provider of last resort for left behind populations when they are impacted by large-scale complex risk. Thank you.
Thanks. Dennis.
Well, as I tried to say in my introduction, I mean, I think we need to look at black swans as opportunities to make the major structural changes and changes to mindset that we've all sort of tried to develop, but we're doing it incrementally. It takes a sort of catastrophic event to galvanize and catalyze people to make the necessary changes. So I think we need to look for the opportunities, both in terms of COVID and, you know, dealing with pandemics, you know, yes, you know, going back to 1918, but most of us weren't around at that time, and addressing issues. I mean, I think the other obvious reality is that we're dealing with sort of global issues. We have a system that's really based on the nation state, and we do watch lists and everything that ranks country according to countries. And we need another, I'm sure there's other approaches out there that sort of look at sort of the, not just at looking at a country as a risk factor, but the sort of the global factors. Obviously, climate change is a global factor. We don't have a system in place that addresses transnational problems like climate change, like pandemics. Those also need to be sort of anticipated, and new structures and new mindsets need to be developed to address them. So I'm just sort of suggesting that it takes a sort of a catastrophic event to galvanize people to recognize that change is necessary, that the current system is dysfunctional, and we need to take advantage of it and start the ball rolling on some new ways of thinking and new systems in place.
Thank you, Dennis. We have 5 minutes left. We actually have one more question from Luke. Just go ahead.
It's to wish, actually, if I may be so bold. So yeah, building on Dennis's first thing he said, you know, exposing our hindsight bias, and you know, we're in the beginning stages of a pandemic back in the last HNPW. And wouldn't it be interesting if we had a humanitarian forecasting tournament every year at the HNPW? And if that could be agency agnostic, so we got teams that were not flying the flag, but were genuinely trying to put forward questions and then make predictions around them. I think that would be quite an interesting reason why more people would come back to this event. Okay.
That's a brilliant idea, actually. And there's a reception in half an hour. I think we can develop it further in that form, actually. So all that's left now for me is to say thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you, Dennis and Lydia and Nico and Jonas and Angeliki. You've been excellent. I think I bragged in the beginning that we had gotten an excellent panel together, but I think you can now see that we actually did. What we didn't know was that we were going to have such an excellent audience also. Both the comments from the 90-some people who were online and from you here in the room have been really good. I'd like to thank all of you for your participation today. It is an incredibly important topic. And I think if nothing else, we at least have managed to unpack a lot of the complexity that lies in this issue. And I hope that you'll take the discussions home with you to wherever you work, and that it'll be helpful in terms of helping you think laterally around the risks that face us in our daily work. Thank you very much.